So welcome everyone also from my part, and thanks for Thibaut for hosting this series and inviting me to talk about my recent research on the Tabula Peutingeriana and the Black Sea. Now, the title that I have chosen for today sounds a little bit like potluck. There is a little bit of everything in it, and it may seem difficult how a closed lecture with an argument may come out of this talk. I hope by the end we will see that an argument is coming together. The core argument, with many references, is now with the press in a volume on ancient geography by Alexander Podosinov, and some complementary parts of the argument are also forthcoming, one currently under review and the other still in preparation. And you see some references that are on the slides. You don't have to write them down if you're interested in these. I have shared the full slides I'm showing today through a download link, which you find in the chat box. No need to download, but just in case you would like to follow up on some of the references there, you have easy access to it. Now, again, the careless representation of the Black Sea on the Tabula Peutingeriana and the map's possible origin under Julius Caesar. It's always difficult for me to get back to the Tabula Peutingeriana. It's such a massive, such a stupendous, tantalizing work with around 4,000 ancient names on it and a structure that is not always very obvious. So I often really get lost when I approach this work, and I'm not a specialist actually of the ancient geography. So I am very grateful I can lean on a strong body of scholarship, starting with Conrad Miller's first facsimile and discussion of the Tabula Peutingeriana. But then we have many other scholars, including Eckhard Weber, whose facsimile is perhaps the most convenient, and this is the one that I've also chosen for my slides. Many other distinguished colleagues should and could be named here, such as Kai Brodersen or Richard Talbot, the editor-in-chief of the Barrington Atlas, who also published a very handy introductory book on the tabula in 2010. But the colleague from whom I had the pleasure to learn most is actually Michael Rathmann, whose handbook on the tabula, now available in its 4th edition in German, to me seems to be the most concise introduction into the history of ancient geography, cartography, and leading up to the obscure product, the Tabula Peutingeriana. And in its back parts, it has a very handy, collection of pictures with comments from the tabula, which really guide you through and help you identify places. And if that were not enough, there is now a multitude of websites available. One that I've been using most is the Tabula Peutingeriana with the Weber facsimile and many other literary sources. But the most distinguished of these websites is also under the auspices of Michael Rathmann, which provides not only photographs, very sharp resolution photographs of the manuscript we have, but also a stupendous commentary on most names on the tabula. So I've been leaning on these materials. Now, quickly, a few words on what the tabula actually is, more for those who have not been exposed to it. It's considered to be the only extant map of the known world from antiquity. And it's come down to us only in a single manuscript, a parchment produced around 1200 of the Common Era. And it has a very strange structure. It's a book scroll with 33 centimeters width and 672 centimeters in length. That leads to a very strong distortion or a compression, especially of the north-south extensions, and everything seems like geared towards a west-east extension. Further on, this is not a scaled map as it is typical for us today, but a hodological principle is applied. So I will explain that a little bit further on, but to give you some idea, if you look at the Plan Schématique du Réseau de Paris, the metro plan, you see kind of a map which lays out itineraries, pathways, and some of these places show up in places where they should not be in relation to others. But if you do follow up the itinerary, you do get safely to the planned destination. So that is the hodological principle. Now, still 11 out of formerly probably 12 sheets are extant. And what do they cover? So the missing first sheet probably covered perhaps Ireland, but certainly Britain, Spain, and Morocco. And the first extant parchment, which we count as TP2, still has a tiny southeastern tip of Britain, and then largely covers Gaul and a tiny bit of Africa. Now, I don't go through the whole thing, but here we have a glance on Rome. On the fifth segment, we see Roma throning, although we might have a discussion as to whether that is Roma as a female allegory or rather a male figure. That's a problem in itself, which I don't have the time to discuss today, but a throning figure representing the Roman Empire and also representing Roma as the caput viae, as the center of all the roads in Roman Italy. Constantinople then also has a very distinguished vignette on the tabula. So here we see Constantine perhaps throning, or is it also a personification of Constantinople? But then we have the famous sculpture of Constantine as Sol Invictus on the column of Constantinople. Actually, the most distinguished vignette is that of Antioch, beautifully located in northern Syria on the Orontes River. So that shall suffice as a very brief introduction, so everyone has at least some idea of what the tabula is. But when we then look at the research on the Tabula Peutingeriana, one big question is that about the origin of the map, or perhaps the original map. When was it produced? By whom? For whom? With what purpose? And when and why was it updated? So this set of questions then leads us to one of the topics of my paper, or actually the aim is to show that we should consider the origin under Julius Caesar. That is a new suggestion, and it is a little bit bold, but you will see how I'm gonna build up my argument towards it. And I look forward to have that discussed. A new ingredient in the discussion, a relatively new ingredient, is to consider more closely the Black Sea region in this discussion. Of course, every Black Sea scholar repeatedly draws on the representation of the Black Sea in the tabula, but those scholars who study the tabula as a whole very rarely consider what the implications of the Black Sea may be for approaching a date or unraveling the history, with one exception, namely my friend Alexander Podosinov, who has suggested, with a particular view to some Black Sea components, especially the location of Trapezus, that the origin of this map should be sought under in the notes of Agrippa, the friend and deputy emperor of Augustus. So I will return to this thesis later on, show highlight more the connections of the geographical tradition with Augustus and Agrippa, but then move on and will argue that actually these developments should be seen as a terminus antiquem, so for the production of the tabula. Now, another feature of my lecture is then the carelessness of the representation. So I'd like to learn a little bit about the mistakes or the errors that we find, and we have to distinguish right away what would be called error or careless. With that, I do not mean the pragmatic choices that the editor or the producer, the cartographer made, considering the compression of the map. So many pragmatic choices had to be made. If we look at, say, the vignette of Constantinople, yeah, the Golden Horn or the Bosporus is very much inflated here to give room for the vignette. That is one pragmatic choice. Other pragmatic choices we find when we look into the corners of the Black Sea, here represented as well as a worm or as a hose, a very thin and lengthy entity. Of course, there is not enough space to name all the cities on the western or eastern shore. That has to be condensated, and then many of the towns we'll find in the other in the southwestern, northwestern parts, and accordingly. So these are not the errors I mean. But a good example for errors that have deeper meaning we find when we look at the Maiotis, that is the Sea of Azov. And surprisingly, we see that it is closed. Though it is open to the north, in fact, even twice. So there is one unnamed river here, which connects it to the northern sea, to the ocean. And then there is another connection this way, which is also unnamed. And one of them might be identified with the Tanais River, for which there are mythical traditions. But there is no tradition that would show the Maiotis completely closed, although it's called sometimes a lake, and that might be the reason for it. But it requires a high degree of ignorance to close up the famous straits, the Bosporus, the Cimmerian Bosporus. Now, this is the kind of mistake I mean. Okay, we are now, well, I've said enough to make sure everyone is in a position to follow my argument, to know what this is all about. And I have 5 further steps through which I'd like to walk with you. First, what is the Tabula Peutingeriana? I'd like to expand a little bit on my initial thoughts on this ancient map. Further on, I'd like to discuss the various time layers that we can identify in the Tabula Peutingeriana. And on this basis, we will then look more closely at the time of Agrippa and Augustus and the sources that have often been adduced for the Tabula Peutingeriana. After that, we'll turn to the Black Sea, and I will have 2 focus sections, one again on the Cimmerian Bosporus and another on Trapezus and other features in the eastern corner of the Black Sea, to show what knowledge was there and was not there for those who were in charge of the map. And finally, after having approached the time of Caesar, I will further solidify my argument by looking more closely at this, well, famous, not only general, but also homme de lettres. So what is the Tabula Peutingeriana? Traditionally, it was considered a travel map. There was dispute whether it was more for administrative purposes, an official state travel map, or just a private, just for private use. But well, everyone had to acknowledge in this debate that this map was never widely disseminated. We have just one single medieval manuscript and no other references in the ancient sources. So probably it was not a Baedeker like Tourist Guide or Lonely Planet travel guide that was in wide use. And in fact, if you had relied on it, you were really very much at the odds of luck. Some parts are very accurate and clear, whereas others are completely random and lacunose. So not really a very useful map altogether. I did mention that it's not a scaled map, but follows a hodological principle. And we might describe that principle as a visualization of itineraries, or in other words, it's a compilation, a visual compilation of itineraries. Kai Brodersen shaped the notion Routendiagramm, and now it's covered on my slide. Michael Rathmann suggests that we speak of a chorographical map. Now, the next major suggestion that had been made is that this was actually not a travel map, but it was geared towards the representation of Roman imperial ideology. And one of the most outspoken proponents of that idea is Richard Talbot nowadays. And if we look at Throning Roma on this same slide, we get some idea, and there are many other examples that could be adduced. If we move to the very eastern corner to India on segment 12, we find a Templum Augusti. So yeah, that is certainly another feature of imperial ideology. Yet, if we should claim that this were the overall function, we would run into problems. There are so many things that one would expect that are not on the map. The theme of Augustus is treated very inconsistently. We do not even find Actium on the map. And while keeping the map on the eastern Indian shore, we find that the theme of Alexander is even much more prominent. I read one section: Hic Alexander responsum accepit, usque quo Alexander. So here Alexander received a response, until where, Alexander. So of course, referencing the turning point in the history, in his Anabasis, very famous in Arrian's account and in many other accounts. So we have certainly multiple possible usages or intentions, and we might add to these geographical scholarship. Of course, we do have, in a certain way, a condensation of geographical scholarship in a uniquely visualized way, despite all the oddities and limitations. And we might even speak of a piece of art, not only considering the vignettes, how they may have been painted, or city icons, but also the skill, ars or techne as a skill of visualizing data and information. Though I do know that Michael Rathmann, for example, he has cautioned me not to think too highly of the art, at least not of the art of the medieval copy, which is below the average of, say, the medieval painters when we look at biblical illustrations, for example. So altogether, what we find is perhaps a little bit of all and none of that. The purpose we can only identify and approach when we decide for a certain time layer, a certain version, whereas the medieval version that we have has undergone so many changes that it's very difficult to identify one specific function. So that is then the natural transition to my question for the time layers, and these are conflicting. So I will not speak about the light medieval touch-ups, which have been identified and collected by Michael Rathmann, and there are discussions as to whether some of them might date to 800, 1200, or 1500. They are very limited. they largely relate to the German area and even partly even more closely to southern Germany, to perhaps the home of the monk who painted, who copied the map. And they can easily be ignored when we try to look at the map more largely. What we do see is a very strong late antique flavor. At least that is the prevailing view. And the most obvious reference for this is, again, the vignette of Constantinople, the city that was founded between 325 and 330. So we have a terminus a quo, at least for this part of the map. And many other scholars have also referred to Antioch, which was, again, one of the most important imperial residences in the 4th century. Konrad Miller suggested that the map was created in the mid-4th century by a certain Castorius, but that figure remains very shady in our evidence, and Miller did not find a lot of support. Much more popular has been the explanation that the Tabula Peutingeriana is actually a product of a cartographic project that is attested for the time of Theodosius II in the 430s, a poem by a certain Diquil, which is collected in the Antologia Palatina, names a certain Aemilius Probus as a cartographer who had done a lot of research to produce a very distinguished map of the world. Yet, if we should follow this argument, why is it then that we do not find a strong Christianized layer? And there are many other problems with such a late date, even if we concede that yes, even Probus may have drawn on ancient sources for sure, but he does not seem to have given any kind of a thorough update. And I'll explore three categories: Christianizations, barbarians, and the imperial residences. Let's start with Christianization, because that is put forward by some scholars as the strongest argument for a production after after Constantine. But if we then look at Constantinople again, that is the pagan Constantinople, nothing Christian there. Antioch, a center of early Christianity since the days of Paul and Barnabas, not at all a reference to Christianity. And then we look to Judea, no Bethlehem, no Nazareth mentioned on the map. So what else would we find in Judea and Palestine? So it's quite interesting how Jerusalem is named. We find the comment Antea dicta Jerusalem modo Helia Capitolina. Helia is miswritten for Aelia Capitolina, which points to the refoundation under Hadrian in the 2nd century. Clearly this, well, when it is named as formerly Jerusalem, this must date pre-Constantine, under whom Jerusalem, of course, became very famous as a center of Christianity again. And then further, there is the Mons Oliveti, very famous in Christian society due to the references in the New Testament with Jesus's prayer in the night before his crucifixion. But I consulted with my friend Rabbi Ben Skolnick, who told me that, of course, the Mons Oliveti also holds a very distinguished place in the Jewish recollection. So many references in the Jewish Bible or the Christian Old Testament go to this as well. So what else do we have? There are very interesting comments written into the Negev desert. So here I quote, "Desertum ubi quadraginta annis eraverunt," sorry for the typo, that's mine, "filii Israelis ducente Moise." So the desert where for 40 years the sons of Israel were straying around with Moses as leader. And there is another reference attached to the Mons Sina, hic legem acciperunt in Monte Sina. So what we have here, I don't think that is Christian. It's rather that we here have some Jewish edits that did not even change the whole map. I think that at some point, a predecessor of the tabula as we have it since the 12th century just wrote on it in the area, into the open field, some comments that were of interest to Jews, but not to Christians. Is there nothing Christian at all in the map? Actually, there is. I've identified only a single one. And for that, we have to go back to Rome, because the monument here to the west of Rome is actually annotated as Ad Sanctum Petri, which refers to St. Peter on Vatican, which was built between 319 and 333, even though the representation does not fit the Peter's Basilica, the ancient Peter's Basilica as all, which had 5 naves and was cross-shaped. But we should not press the iconographic evidence, because we see lots of simplified standards on the map. But I wonder whether the Lateran Basilica would not have been a more obvious choice as the first basilica or church of the Bishop of Rome, and which was inaugurated in 324. So I am rather suspicious for another reason. How is it that a Christian who revised the map would only have concentrated on the Latin West without considering the important places of the Eastern Mediterranean, most of all Jerusalem, Bethlehem, and so on? So I think that we have traces of a reallocation of a formerly pagan building, perhaps even the imperial palace on the Palatine Mount, which was also visible from the Via Triumphalis, and in fact better visible than the Peter's Church. And I guess that a medieval editor might have had an interest in this reference to the see of the Pope. So I assign the only Christian element that I could identify to the light medieval touch-ups, which leaves us with basically no Christian elements for the ancient layers. But what about the barbarians? It's also quite interesting whom we find. So there is a reference to the Vandals named Vanduli, but they are still north of the Danube, so not in Gaul, in Spain, or in Northern Africa. And the Vandals were known to the Romans since the late 2nd century CE. The Goths are not mentioned at all, but they became the main, nemesis, or one of the main nemesises of the Romans in the West, at least, since 260 BC, but definitely since the Battle of Adrianople in 378, not mentioned at all. And then, yes, Alamans and Franks, who were important enemies of the Romans in the 3rd century, they are mentioned, but not in the most typical name shape that would be Alemanni and Franki, but rather in the shape of Alemannia and Francia, which has induced other scholars to also suggest that we have medieval additions here in the area of Germany. So we have thus indications, once again, that point to the 3rd or 2nd centuries. What other indications do we have for earlier layers? What about the imperial residences? Well, we don't find Trier, Milan, Ravenna, Salona or Spalatum, Thessalonica, Nicomedia. They are there as either road stations or cities, but not as imperial residences. So here this map shows the major residences in the later 3rd, early 4th century, and the stars show you the 3 potentially imperial residences that the Tabula Peutingeriana offers us. So this is not a late antique flavor, except for Constantinople. And with the open question of what Antioch actually means, but Antioch was a royal city since, of course, the Seleucids since around 300 BCE, and then remained a center of administration also through Roman times. So I have mentioned a couple of edits or materials that point to the High Empire. We might, so I repeat the Aelia Capitolina. I might mention the name for Trier, which is not late Roman Treveri or Treveris, which is not even the official name Augusta Treverorum, but it is the somewhat obscure version of Augusta Tresvirorum. And Tresviri was one, well, funny name or sobriquet given to the Treverans or to the Treveri, first attested by Cicero, so in the times of Julius Caesar already. So this is what, but since it has the city was founded under Augustus, we probably have a still very early time layer in the 1st century. Another most frequently mentioned item is Pompeii, the city that was destroyed by the eruption of the Vesuvius in 79 CE. And it's mentioned here. I've given you the indication, or I've made added a copy of the photograph. However, it's often said that this must point to a layer that predates the eruption of the Vesuvius. I have learned, however, from Michael Rathmann that we do not find here the icon of a large city. It may also be a major road station, and Pompeii could have been a road station also after 79. So it may still be 2nd century or so. Now, let us move forward, or rather, let us move backwards further in time. We are now approaching the time of Augustus as a time for which we could identify pieces of information. I have already shown the Templum Augusti in India. In the environment of Rome, we have the monumental harbor of Ostium, which is also, well, refers to the time of Augustus. And then we have evidence for the Mappa Mundi under Augustus in the Porticus Vipsania, based on the notes of Agrippa. I will have the sources very soon for you. But in this context, when I'm rehearsing the chronological layers, let me just say that older scholarship has often emphasized that these sources or this time must have been an inspiration for the map. Perhaps it's even the source or the origin. And it's Alexander Podosinov who has claimed that the Mappa Mundi in the Porticus Vipsania is most likely the direct ancestor of the Tabula Peutingeriana. Michael Rathmann has a completely different explanation. He will soon show up again on the next slide as the proponent of a Hellenistic layer, but he thinks that the adaptation of a Greek original map into a Latin map was likely happened under Augustus. Caesar is only my suggestion, and the arguments will come later. So I more or less conclude the chronological survey by coming back to Michael Rathmann's suggestion that actually, in essence, we have a map going back to Eratosthenes. He has very many strong arguments, and the most compelling argument that he has is that probably the shapes of the map were already outlined perhaps around 200 BCE, and then further adjustments were mostly confined to filling the map with city names, rivers, and so on, but the outline shape, with very few exceptions, remained unchanged. And he speaks of an archetype, which I find a little bit unhappy, but to give one example of his theory that the shapes were not changed later on the map of India, towards the very end, we find a very small addition, Sera Major, which is Greater China. So a very, very small portion of the map allocated to China, which became known to the Romans only in the times of Augustus. So I would still not speak of an archetype, which in philology has a somewhat different meaning. You cannot have these many changes and then still speak of an archetype. I would rather speak of a base map that was then refilled and reused. And I think the arguments are very strong. In addition, Radmann and also others make many suggestions and detailed discussions that some clusters show a clearly Hellenistic flavor. Now, let us now approach the Agrippa's notes and the map of on the Porticus Vipsania. And I quote from Pliny in his Naturalis Historia, book 3, paragraph 17. So at present, the length of Baetica from the frontier of the town of Caslona to Cadiz is 250 miles, and from the seafront of Murgi, 25 miles more. Its breadth from Carteia along the coast to Guadiana is 234 miles. Agrippa was a very painstaking man and also a very careful geographer, who therefore could believe that when intending to set before the eyes of Rome a survey of the world, he made a mistake, and with him the late lamented Augustus. For it was Augustus who completed the portico containing a plan of the world that had been begun by his sister in accordance with the design and memoranda of Marcus Agrippa. So this is in a discussion of Iberian geography, a reference to the map in the Porticus Vipsania based on the notes of Agrippa, which Pliny found very authoritative. In fact, he quotes the notes of Agrippa many more times, and 5 times he quotes them for the part of the Black Sea coast, which ranges from Byzantion to Pantikapaion. So the western half, if you want, the references are here, and never is he criticized for being lax. There is no very specific reference to the East, except in Book 6, paragraph 3. There is a reference to the overall extension of the Black Sea from the Thracian Bosporus, here with Chalcedon denoted, up to Phasis, and then from Phasis to the Cimmerian Bosporus, the Bosporan kingdom, for which the data of Agrippa are referred. So it means we can be sure that Agrippa also engaged with scholarship on the eastern half of the Black Sea. Let's add to this one further connection that Agrippa had with the Black Sea. In the year 14 BCE, he was on a naval campaign and harbored in Sinope for a couple of months. He was planning to attack the Bosporan kingdom under Queen Dynamis, who had been refusing to take in King Polemo of Pontus as her husband, and with that then also as the supreme leader, who would then have united Pontus, Colchis, and the Bosporan kingdom again. But after a while, only the presence of the Roman fleet with its allied fleets induced Dynamis to give in. So this is another potential source of knowledge that Agrippa may have had, and Alexander Potosinov said that much of the evidence, even some skewed evidence on Trapezus, to which I will soon turn, could have come from Polemon. So my counter view is that the evidence I've already presented implies that Agrippa had so precise knowledge of the Black Sea that he cannot be the source of the very inaccurate representation of the Black Sea. And in order to underpin that, in the next step of my argument, I'm going to present 2 minor case studies, the Cimmerian Bosporus and Trapezus. So I did mention already the problems of the Maiotis, But let's look at the towns that are named there. We have, well, starting at the left or in the west, we have Salomime and Kabakos, unknown places not identified. Then Theagina is probably misspelled for Theodosia, which finally we can map on a more reliable map of the Bosporan kingdom. Next, we have Hermokanymphi, which is a garbled conflation of two towns. One is Nymphaion and the other on the European part of on the Crimea, and Hermonassa on the extension of the Taman Peninsula. And then come Chimerium, Bruani, Amurni, Makara, all unknown places, very garbled. But that's not all. We should be very concerned that we don't find Pantikapaion and Phanagoreia, the two royal residences. Well, there may have been a reference to them if we move further to the east, away from the Maiotis. We find the very obscure place Phamacorum, and perhaps that is garbled out of Phanagoreia and Pantikapaion. But even that would not be easily explicable with later copyist errors, but rather that would be a conceptual mistake to place these towns so far away. So the one who produced the Tabula Peutingeriana probably used heterogeneous and partly very poor materials to put together his information. But one further point can be made about these two cities. We know that under Polemon, who lived from, or who ruled over the Bosporan kingdom from 14 to 9, perhaps 8 BCE, these two royal residences were renamed into Caesarea and Agrippa. Although Agrippa died in 12 BCE, either he or his sister or Augustus, they would sure have been informed about the name change, and sure the world map would have named the cities this way, Caesarea and Agrippa, to honor especially also Agrippa. So we have another indication that this name change should be a terminus antequem for the origin of our Tabula Peutingeriana. Now let's move to the east towards Trapezus. And I have to move this again. So to give you some more context, I've also named Missos, which is how Amisos or Samsun is represented, and Polemonium Bolaman. And well, let's see where these cities are located on a modern scale map. So we see something big has happened, something has moved these cities further east, or rather around the corner of the Black Sea. The traditional view is, well, that's just a result of compression. There is nothing more to it. However, Alexander Podosinov has argued that there is a broader tradition which shows Trapezus in the northeastern corner of the Black Sea. And he said that, well, this is a tradition he may have received from Polemo, and this is a way how he tries to excuse Agrippa, still claiming that he had some information, some authoritative information. But all the evidence that Podosinov produces is after at the time of the Mappa Mundi of Augustus, and might thus be dependent on this map. And further on, all the evidence is very unsure. I only give one example here, the famous route map from Dura Europos, and we can, well, Podosinov read the river, the Danube River, then Trapezus, and at the end Artaxata in Armenia. So arguing that basically this map was so flawed it could give one straight line, which largely speaking would make Trapezus appear on the northern coast of the Black Sea. This was already quite speculative, but is really not tenable. There are much better readings, and I have referenced them in my written paper. So we have the Danube and we have Trapezus here as the table rock on the Crimea. And Achta clearly are the straits, which is the Bosporus, and the Bosporus is also mentioned in some legible letters. And here Chersonesos, also on the Crimea, is mentioned. So we have to eliminate this piece of evidence. There's much more going on in the east around Trapezus. Another big oddity is that the whole extension over Apsaros, Phasis, up to Dioscurias or Sebastopolis, Sebastopolis being a major harbor of the Romans. Actually, all these towns had major harbors in Roman imperial times. They were missing on the Black Sea, and it seems that a later editor felt the need to add them. And but then there was no space left, so he moved Sebastopolis far away and then makes it border the Northern Sea, which is quite nonsensical. I can't go into all the details, but I'd like to focus on the location of Trapezus, which actually shows up where Dioscurias would have been located. Dioscurias, the most famous city, even more famous than Phasis, in the archaic, early classical period, as the trade hub in the eastern Black Sea region, the trade hub of Colchis. And I published various articles where I suggest some new location, but the changes there do not really affect my argument on Trapezus, which roughly shows up by the greater Caucasus and surrounded by the major rivers that are typical for Dioscurias. Now, my main argument has been in these earlier works that some of the problems of locating places in the East are the problem of mythogeography. With Greek colonists, also Greek myths came into the area, especially the Argonautic myth, and gradually the Argonautic myth shaped the perception of the Greeks of these areas, whereas these areas then also influenced backwards the stories that were told in Greece. And we see a rivalry to occupy the space of the kingdom of Aya, the city of King Aietes, where Jason was on his quest for the Golden Fleece, where he met Medea, and so on. And I've so far identified sources locating Aya in Dioscurias, in Phasis, and then up the Phasis River, here Samtredia, and the most famous later on became Kütaia or Kütaion, which is modern Kutaisi, and has the most, most modern scholars actually consider Kutaisi to be the ancient Phasis, the ancient city of Aya, but only at a later development. So my analysis would go back to the beginning of Milesian colonization of the Black Sea area, which of course we cannot rehearse here, but against all the scholars that insist that Colchis has always been identified with the land of Aya, I'd say that the oldest evidence seems to speak very much against this, and the oldest firm piece of evidence that identifies or that locates Aya in Colchis is Pindar in the Pythian ode from 462. And then with all the imperial changes, first Milesian dominance, then Athenian hegemony after the defeat of the Athenians, Sinopean hegemony in the area, we also see new developments and new shapes of the ideology, and often that led to an extension of what Colchis or the land of Aya was and what the specific location of Aya was. And only in the year 401 or 400, we are on firmer ground with the arrival of Xenophon. Xenophon in his Anabasis describes his arrival. And he says when he reaches Trapezus, he arrived in Colchis. So, and then he's waging war in Colchis. And then he does not mention Aya, but he refers to the Phasis River. and the kingdom of Maiotis located up the river. So we see a certain development here. And what I claim, but in a much longer argument that I cannot unfold here, is that we see gradually after Xenophon a further development which led to the relocation of Aia and the identification of Aia with Trapezus. So I only mention, so here I give the quotation of Xenophon, who does not yet identify Aia with Trapezus, but already locates Trapezus in the land of Colchis. But this conflation has, this mythogeographical extension has led to a lot of confusion in our geographical literature, and we still can see that confusion in Strabo, Pliny, and Arrian, who have many consistent points of views. Sometimes they clearly separate Trapezus and its environs from Colchis. Sometimes they make Trapezus and Colchis immediate neighbors and even locate Colchis up to the Hysulimen. So we see how these traditions interacted with each other, and a major additional argument, which I cannot unfold here, is the relocation of tribes originally related with the Argonautic myth, with the environs of the kingdom of Aia, the Sani, Suani, Sanigai. They move from the greater Caucasus in the environment of Dioscurias, virtually, not physically, virtually, in the geographical accounts into the environs of Trapezus. And the same we can say about the Henioki. So we clearly see this movement, and that is reflected in the Tabula Peutingeriana. It's actually our only source which specifically locates Trapezus in a place where one might have expected Aia. And that's a tradition that was no longer upheld, say, in the times of Strabo. Again, it predates the age of Augustus, and it was not compatible with first-hand knowledge that scholars or even explorers such as Agrippa might have gained in the area. Finally, we are reaching the last short chapter of my presentation, Roman cartography under Caesar and Augustus. Now, I've been claiming Caesar as the origin behind it, and there is a marvelous source that proves what a strong interest Caesar in cartography has had. Not as if it were not enough to read the Bellum Gallicum and the Bellum Civile with its geographical detail, but there is an otherwise lost reference in the Geographi Latini Minores, and I here only have the Latin quotation, but you can see something happens when Julius Caesar and Mark Antony were consuls, that is in 44, in the last months of Caesar's life. And we hear that four Greek scholars were entrusted with the description of the whole world. A certain Nicodemus, Didymus, Theodotos, and Polykletos. Now, it's Theodotos, who was assigned the northern areas, and scholars agree that these would have included the Black Sea area and probably even Asia Minor. So we have the later indication that Theodotos finished his work in the 10th consulate of Augustus, which would take us to year 24. But then there is a second chronological indication which says that the work lasted 28 years and 8 months. That would take us to late 17 BCE, and there is a discrepancy. A way of harmonizing it, though harmonizing is always very difficult, might be to say that this Theodotos might have worked on this project earlier, but was then hired by Caesar and integrated into this larger project. But either of these dates are prior to the campaign of Agrippa in 14 BCE, prior to his death in 12, and then also prior to the construction of the Porticus Vipsania with a map which might have been unfolded in the next 10 or 15 years or so. So we should assume that Augustus and his scholars, his artists, they could draw on this expertise that had been accumulated under sea, or had been accumulated beginning with the last days of Caesar's life. I would suggest, however, that Caesar was, well, when he was starting his campaign to the east, that he had a strong interest in world geography and cartography. We all know very well that Caesar was planning a major Parthian campaign, and 2 days before its scheduled departure, he was killed on the Ides of March, 44 BCE. But I allow myself the speculation that it would yield a very plausible context that in this situation, Caesar, or perhaps even in the years before, Caesar might have already set up a smaller project, which resulted in the collection of Hellenistic material, cartographical material, and geographical, chorographical material, and had then resulted in the first Latin world map. And when he saw the result, he might have been very disappointed, saying or seeing for himself many inaccuracies, seeing the need, the desideratum of much more research, and then perhaps appointing the scholars who should have done their work before, until he would come back from his Parthian campaign. But it would take them until the middle, until Augustus would be firmly established. And why not allow, again, the speculation that Augustus might have appointed Agrippa as being in charge of that project, supervising this project. And Agrippa, the famous general and administrator, who may not have had as much time to do research on the entire world, but obviously he would have drawn on the research that was being done in Rome by 4 experts. It's quite unthinkable that the notes of Agrippa did not include, in fact, were not substantially based on this research. And that would explain why Pliny or Strabo, well, let's say why Pliny does not mention any of these 4. I do not want to draw on Strabo because Strabo does not mention the other 4, the Greek 4 scholars either. But if we look at the evidence in Pliny for the notes of Agrippa and the map, one should wonder why Agrippa is the reference and not the project established by Caesar under the names of 4 Greek scholars. So I come up with the most plausible conclusion for me, admitting some speculation and some hypothetical elements here, is that Caesar was the one who would have had an interest in compiling, in producing this map, but he would have seen the deficiencies of that map, then started a major research project, which was then finished under Agrippa and Augustus. However, the map would live on very narrowly and very randomly. It's such a big lot that it has come down to us after a few revisions, possibly in the Augustan age, certainly under Hadrian, and probably once more under Constantine. Before then, it was not retouched again before perhaps the Carolingian age. So this is where I could conclude. I have 3 more slides, but I need not add them right now and can keep them for the discussion if needed. Thank you very much for your attention.